guys, this is Larry. I'm just going to go over a little bit of the fluid compartments because a lot of you guys seem a little bit confused about it. So when you think of fluid compartments, what you want to think about is the left-hand side here. Okay, that's going to be the ICF, and the right-hand side here are going to be the ECF. And whenever you see those shifts from, like, let's say the left to the right or the right to the left, you're going to have a change in osmolarity. Meaning, if this left side here, if that salt, the osmolarity, was all the way up here, that's going to have a lot more osmotic pull. And because it has a lot more osmotic pull, you'll see water leaving this compartment on the right-hand side and moving into the compartment on the left-hand side. Okay, so when you see that osmotic change, that's when you see water flowing from one compartment into the other compartment. So when you look at IV isotonic saline, what's happening? Well, we're adding saline to the right-hand side because we're adding it into the ECF, right? It goes in through IV. Now, is there going to be a change from left to right or right to left in terms of shift in fluid volume? Well, no, because it's isotonic, so the salt is exactly the same. So here on the right-hand side, we're increasing in volume. But there's not going to be any kind of volume change on the left side, and there's not going to be any osmolar change because it's IV saline. Well, what about with diarrhea? With diarrhea, it's exactly the opposite. We're losing isotonic solution. So when we lose isotonic solution, what happens? Here on the right-hand side, we're losing volume. The salt isn't changing, right? The osmolarity isn't changing because we're losing an isotonic solution. And the left-hand side won't change, the volume won't change, and the osmolarity won't change because there wasn't any change in osmolarity. Okay? Now, what about in salt tablets? So I'm going to do this my way, and the numbers don't really match up to the ones there, but you can just take a look at this, and this is mechanistically how I think is the best way of looking at it. So what happens if I give you salt tablets? Well, in the ECF on the right-hand side, you're going to gain a little bit more salt. Right? It's going to become more salty, it's going to have higher osmolarity. Since this is higher osmolarity, what's going to happen? It's going to have higher osmotic draw, so water is going to leave the left-hand side and enter into the right-hand side. What is that going to do? Well, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to increase the osmolarity of the left-hand side. Right? Water is leaving from this compartment, the left hand, to the right hand until they have the same amount of osmolarity, which also means that the volume on the left-hand side is going to decrease. What does that mean? It means the volume on the right-hand side will increase because volume is going from the left all the way to the right. Now, what about sweating? In sweating, even though sweat is salty, think of it as losing water. So what happens in sweat? In sweat, the first thing that happens is you're losing water. And what happens when you lose water? When you lose water in the right-hand side, right, because the water is coming out of your ECF, right, it's coming out of your plasma, the water that's left is going to become more, it's going to have a higher osmolarity because you're losing more water than you are salt. And that volume you have on the right-hand side is going to decrease, which means with the same amount of salt basically there, it's going to have a higher osmolarity. Now what's going to happen? Since this has a higher osmolarity, water is going to leave this compartment on the left-hand side and enter into the compartment on the right-hand side, meaning that the left-hand side is going to match the osmolarity of the right-hand side, and the volume of the left-hand side is going to shrink, while the volume of the right-hand side is going to increase. Okay? Now what about adrenal insufficiency? Whenever you see adrenal insufficiency, think of low aldosterone. Now, what does aldosterone do? Well, aldosterone makes you retain sodium. And by retaining sodium in your kidneys, you also retain water. So if you don't have enough aldosterone, because you have adrenal insufficiency, you can't retain that sodium, which means that the osmolarity will drop. And what happens when the osmolarity drops? The amount of water will also drop. Okay? Because wherever the salt goes, that's where the water goes. So since we're losing all the sodium in the kidneys tubules, we're also going to lose a lot of water, and we're going to pee it out. Okay? So now that this has a lower osmolarity than the left-hand side, what's going to happen? Well, the left-hand side is going to draw water from this right-hand side. And once that water is drawn over, this will have the same osmolarity. It'll draw water until the osmolarity matches, and the volume will increase. And of course, the volume will decrease on the right-hand side because water is leaving the right-hand side, going into the left-hand side. Okay? And finally, there's a lot of question about what D5W is versus IV normal saline. So let's imagine right now we have someone who's in shock. Okay, they have really low BP, and we want to increase their BP. Should we give them D5W, or should we give them IV normal saline? Well, if we give them D5W, what happens? D5W is water with some sugar in it, some glucose, a version of glucose called dextrose. Now, that's not going to have the same kind of osmotic draw as, let's say, IV saline. And because it doesn't have the same osmotic draw, all that water, the D5W, that we enter into the vasculature in the ECF, all that water is going to go into the ICF because the ECF might have a greater volume, but its osmolarity is decreased because we're essentially giving it water. Now all the water will leave the ECF on the right-hand side and go into the ICF on the left-hand side, okay, until the osmolarity equalizes. That's probably not very good if your patient's in shock because you want to maintain that blood pressure. So instead of giving D5W, it's probably better to give something such as IV normal saline, because that saline, as we saw all the way in the beginning, that saline will stay in the ECF. Okay, I hope that helps you guys. I know the arrows don't fully match, but this is the way I can think of that best describes everything. If you have any questions, just Facebook message me or email me. Okay, thanks a lot.